The UC Vanguard was founded in 2315, only 15 years away from the start of the player's story in Starfield, and operates, as far as I'm aware, as an ad hoc galactic militia. When thinking about Starfield, the closest real historical equivalent I can think of is the American colonization of the post-revolutionary period. This was the headspace I was in before going into the UC Vanguard, and having to go through the flight training and history lesson beforehand gave the sense that I was an immigrant being speeded through and processed in a provisional and poor quality onboarding system so that I could be chattel used as labor on the fringes of the galaxy. I had imagined myself performing humdrum duties like resolving rural border disputes, squashing rebellions, ferrying equipment and material goods to science facilities, or investigating a communications blackout, which incidentally is the context for the very first UC Vanguard mission. Imagine my surprise, then, when the first UC Vanguard mission quest immediately capitalizes on the brief foreshadowing of the Terramorph. The first mission, which was originally given as an in-and-out delivery of communications materials for an agricultural science facility, turned into a horror story of trying to kill a Terramorph by powering back on the facility's turret defense system. I found the first mission of the UC Vanguard, therefore, to be a good mission in the wrong place. I enjoyed the novelty of having a motion tracker beep to a rhythm that was tied to its proximity to the player. Unfortunately, though Bethesda derived their material from other famous science fiction narratives, specifically the Alien series, which proved they spent time thinking about how to place Starfield among its forebears, they did not follow through. For instance, one of the key aspects of a monster movie like Alien is to not show the monster for half of its runtime. In that way, you build anticipation for the monster. Showing the Terramorph in the first mission of the UC Vanguard was a mistake not only for this reason, but follow-up missions lack believability. Remember, when the UC Vanguard is introduced, we have to imagine that I had just come off the boat from Vectera and Crete. Just because I was the first cop on the scene does not imply I would be its key investigator. A far better solution would have been this. You are stationed on Tau City 2 for your rotation, and you serve as a liaison for the planet. Here you perform rather drudging work of delivering goods, but along the way you get the sense that something troubling is going on, and perhaps your previous UC Vanguard station officer, the one you're replacing, had caught on to the problem, but there is disbelief from the Tau City engineers and scientists. Perhaps their old office, the one you're entering when you begin, has been left in shambles, and you read through his notes detailing random attacks on wildlife, facilities losing power, giant holes in fencing, you name it. And when you read the officer's notes, these locations are tagged as places on Tau City you can explore, and you can see the damage for yourself, as well as talk to the people there. They might be dismissive, saying that the damage is nothing bigger than what they encounter with the local herbivores, or maybe they might say that the officer was crazy in other ways, or they might point out his substance abuse problems, which might have turned out to be true. You did happen to find several drug stashes in their office as well. You're left with a quandary in those early missions, one that you can muse about as you complete the drudging labor of the UC Vanguard. Then, and only then, after maybe 3 or 4 of these, do you hit the player up with the Terramorph quest. The rest of the UC Vanguard, however, opts for spectacle, with you taking center stage. You take the role of a key agent in the unraveling of the Terramorph plot, analyzing tissue from the beasts thanks to the help of Hadrian and Percival Walker, who were both xeno-warfare scientists during the Colony War. In this context, you are here to settle old debts, old repressions in the United Colonies that reveal the darker underbelly of the biggest of the 3 major players. In order to settle the threat of the Terramorph attacks, you fight off an attack of Terramorphs on New Atlantis itself, which accelerates the chance to enter the archives of the United Colonies for research into the Terramorphs. You discover that an old general, Vae Victus, was never really executed for his crimes, but kept alive in an underground cell for his abilities. We discover that Vae Victus is secretly behind the Terramorph attacks, as we find a recording that reveals that, during the Colony War, he discovered a way to instantaneously transform heat leeches into the monsters using a native plant from the planet Londinian. The player is given several ending choices to wrap up the narrative, a chance to settle the Terramorphs using a supposedly quicker and less safe option, versus a longer and supposedly more safe option, as well as what to do about Vae Victis, either to reveal his plan for the manipulation that it is, or use another general, a fugitive named Reginald Orlais, as a scapegoat. Afterward, you are free to take on several epilogue quests wrapping up the Terramorph threat, as well as performing several space dogfighting quests. The theoretical benefits of the UC Vanguard are plain to see. The player is privy to the history and lore about the Colony War. We learn about cloning, the Red Devils, the history of Terramorph research, as well as gain insight into the logistics of politics of the Inner Cabinet of the United Colonies and their communications with the Freestar Collective and House Faroon. The trade-off in this questline is in the lacking ability for the player to imagine what the typical life of a UC Vanguard might be. Let's take a lesson from Morrowind once again. The closest equivalent faction to the UC Vanguard in Morrowind is likely the Imperial Legion, and as a member of a garrison force in peacetime in a backwater territory, you are in charge of keeping the peace and facilitating the Empire's economic goals. Some of the quests you'll encounter in the Legion include recovering a deed from a widow, rescuing a pilgrim from Ashlander outcasts, investigating the disappearance of a tax collector, raiding smugglers, killing a Legion deserter. While these quests may lack connectivity and progression in a larger story, in these and various other quests, you learn quite a lot about the Imperial Legion itself as an occupational force, though this isn't something that's hammered into your head explicitly. Instead, the specificity of these quests, not to mention your role in the quest, reveal to you that your duty as police may come with using too firm of a hand. We therefore learn about the Empire incidentally. The Legion offers 19 quests in total, while the UC Vanguard offers only 9. Now, unfortunately, I still don't quite know what the UC Vanguard really does, even after completing the questline. Instead, all I really learned is what the United Colonies did 20 years ago. Bethesda was unwilling to use the player's actions as material for the story itself. The deepest insight to gain in all of this is that the UC Vanguard quests suffer because it is difficult to differentiate it from other questlines, as many of the point-by-point actions a player takes in the UC Vanguard differs little from other quests. It seems that the writers and developers of these quests did not really know what to do with the player in between these narrative developments. One clear example to me of this is the repetition of the Percival Walker quest inside of the quest Friends Like These. In this quest, the player is tasked with having to get the approval of all 3 major players, the United Colonies, the Freestar Collective, and House Faroon, in order to enter the Archives, which is a silo for forbidden information on technology used during the Colony War. The ambassador inside the House Faroon embassy has been radio silent for quite some time. The player is charged with entering the embassy and freeing Balmur. The similarities interest here. We have to navigate a space to rescue an old man. While they may have differing flavors of interaction, with the latter quest taking place in a confusing, overgrown embassy, and despite the fact that we are delivering something from one old man and retrieving something from another, the methodology for the player is one and the same, considering the only dividing line between completion is a string of dialogue with the NPC. It is as if the stories are written without any consideration of how the player might find meaning in the carrying out of their actions. The lowest point of this questline occurs with the attack of the Terramorph in New Atlantis. When the attack begins, we are currently in a meeting with the cabinet members of the capital. The argument we're bringing to the cabinet is to provide access to the archive, where we can investigate the Terramorph history during the Colony War. The exchange between the player and its members is, of course, rather elementary, dreadfully underdeveloped, and its members, particularly this Yasin, have contradictory points embedded within their own arguments. In any case, the arguing proves to be for naught, because regardless of the decision, a Terramorph attacks New Atlantis during the exchange. We learn later through the retconning of the plot that Vae Victis did this intentionally to speed ahead the retrieval of the archive documents. But any player of video games knows that this situation could not have been resolved without a bringing together of all possible options into a single solution in order for the questline to continue. You gain insight into the politics of the United Colonies, but your actions mean nothing. The meaning-making for a player during their time in the UC Vanguard questline is passive. There are not the incidental lessons of the Imperial Legion in Morrowind. This is a narrow story Bethesda wants to tell themselves. Now, we have to be careful here, because in my first Starfield video, I complained that the text and dialogue of the writing in Starfield feels devoid of specificity, including history. In one sense, it is true that the UC Vanguard questline counters my argument. The point I will make is that much of this history is spoon-fed to the player rather obviously. First through a history museum that covers a lot of ground all too quickly, and this is an explicit system where we push a button and history is fed to us. Throughout the questline, characters like Hadrian and Vae Victis and Percival Walker will dictate to us what happened in the United Colony's darker moments, told rather bluntly and with little fanfare. We have no role in finding out these things for ourselves. We have no initiative. In that way, the disconnect between player and the world still continues, only that the field has shifted. The last thing I will mention about my time with the UC Vanguard concerns this lack of initiative, only this is a more general point against Starfield as a whole. While in the offices of the masked building, I came across a whiteboard that gave an indication of different places within the United Colonies and what their current needs were. However, for the Arcturus location, I saw that they were unresponsive. Seeing that this felt like a novel bit of writing in Starfield, rather than the typical whiteboard schematics or math formulas or post-it notes with vague requests on them, this seemed like actionable information. So eventually I made my way to the Arcturus system, perhaps to figure out where this UC Vanguard facility was, in an attempt to re-establish contact. This, to me, seemed like something a UC Vanguard member could do. When I arrived at the system, I noticed several planets. Out of these planets, there were 3 points of interest. 2 took place in space, and when I arrived, they only had resources to acquire. Another concerned hostile activity in space, which I avoided. A third was an industrial outpost on one of the planets. When I arrived, I discovered it was a Radiant quest that I had heard before. I thought of another way to find the UC Vanguard presence in the system, but I was flummoxed. There was simply too much surface area to cover, and I had no other leads. Now, to be fair, in all likelihood, there was likely never anything in this star system, and this was yet again some flavor text on the wall meant to suggest more than was actually present. Also, too, the mass building covers far more than just the UC Vanguard, and could have been information for any such scientific or industrial endeavor. Like all the posters on the walls advertising films that we will never see, it's all designed to suggest a world much bigger than we can see, but we as players should know better. That's on me. But this opened up a larger criticism about exploration in Starfield, which is that the game is only willing to let you explore based on its terms. If I have the initiative to explore something, I need some kind of goalpost or marker to guide me, otherwise I am simply wandering on the surface of a massive planet, waiting for something to happen. There is little to no actionable data in Starfield which gives the player the initiative to investigate something on their own. What may be more daunting and damning to realize is that the location may never physically exist until I start the logic of the questline. Only then is the tile even created. This means total control for Bethesda. This is not the case in their previous, far more cohesive worlds, which take place in such a uniform way that if players want to strike out on their own and pursue the name of someone on a note, or want to explore a town, they are given papal dispensation because of the framework of the world alone. This could have happened in Starfield with a latitude and longitude system, where a player could land according to coordinates given to players paying attention, and they could use these as a reference or guide. Strangely, this navigating system does not exist. I suspect the reason for this has to do with what they've talked about in their promotional videos, which is that their locations are tied to procedural generation, and not to any sort of particular geographic features of the planet. One specific location for one player may turn out to be totally different for another. Even still, this process could have worked, where the game could have generated coordinates on the fly based on where it would like to place the location for this particular player. None of this exists. Because of that, if a player has ideas or goals, they can only be as specific and narrow as Bethesda would like them to be. A player must therefore passively maneuver through the world, waiting to be told about missions, activities, and factions. This is, in all likelihood, why a player is bombarded with all kinds of dialogue when they reach a new location, because this appears to be the only way a player has a chance of learning about something to do. I have seen online that some people consider the UC Vanguard questline to be the best one of them all, though usually this is in the minority behind the Crimson Fleet. I have to disagree. The UC Vanguard quest robs the player of the ability to proactively investigate. It is derivative of stories like the Alien series, without understanding the core appeal of why the horror genre works, not to mention lacking the psychological depth of a film like Alien, which uses its story to tackle such haunting topics like sexual assault. The questline is unappealing in the passive method of delivering the history of the United Colonies, and invites more questions about the functioning of its world than it answers, particularly House Varun's place as a major power, but also a possibility for clones that is brought up and shoved away. Many of the twists of the quest, like the realization that heat leeches can instantly transform to terramorphs, feels juvenile. If you enjoyed the questline, I implore you to think about how exactly the UC Vanguard differs from the typical quest loops of other questlines. If you enjoyed the world building offered in the UC Vanguard, I would invite you to brainstorm ideas that would have allowed a player to find out this history on their own. If you enjoyed your time as a UC Vanguard captain, I would encourage you to think about the plausibility of the questline, and rather to imagine, as the first entry into this new intellectual property, what would have been better for introducing a player to the present time. Because in my eyes, Bethesda traded the power of knowing this new world for the dark business of understanding its history, when they could have easily done both. Thanks for watching.